Behind every single painting, there are stretcher bars holding it together. But what are the origins of stretcher bars, and is it possible to make your own? Way back in the late medieval period, people didn't paint on canvas. Instead, they predominantly painted on wooden panels. For larger paintings, they would glue or attach multiple panels together. But there was a big problem with wood. It's extremely prone to warping, especially in humid environments. As the medieval era began winding down, linen canvas started appearing across Europe. At first, it wasn't used specifically for painting, but rather for practical purposes like clothing, tents, and sails.
I can't say for sure who the first person was to paint oils onto canvas, but I once came across this fascinating theory. During the late medieval and early Renaissance period, Venice was buying tons of linen for their ship sails. To help identify which boat belonged to which family or business, people would paint patterns directly on the sails. And right there could be an early example of painting on canvas. And let's just take a moment to admire these amazing paintings. These are paintings painted in the 19th century, but do depict what it may have looked like in the late medieval period. They're just amazing. And why don't they paint sails like this anymore?
Oh wait, yeah, they still do. They're still doing this in Venice. In Venice, you can still see these painted sails and they're amazing. I just wish more sails were painted like this. Although I have to say, the perfectly clean white sails, kind of like the ones in Sorolla paintings, are pretty magical too. But there is something cool about bright red sail. Anyway, I've always loved the idea of painting on sails gradually migrating into the art world. After all, when you're painting outdoors on a canvas, it can really feel like a sail catching the wind. It's poetic, it's rhyming with the past. And I'll be honest, this really is just a theory that I'm particularly inclined to like, right? The reality of the matter is we've been using fabrics to create artworks for a very long time. For example, tapestries. There's also the case of drums. Drums are an example of a stretched material like leather or even fabric that people would often then decorate. How, these ideas fully migrated into the painting world isn't fully clear as far as I'm aware. I'm just particularly fond of the sail one. But the real reason why we started painting on canvas wasn't about poetry, it was about practicality. Canvas offered several advantages. One, unlike wood, canvas didn't warp over time. And two, instead of relying on a large, heavy wooden panel, you only needed a lightweight frame to stretch the canvas onto, making it lighter and saving material. And this is really where stretcher bars first come into play. Early stretcher bars were fixed frames. Artists would stretch the canvas over these frames and secure it. But the problem was that the canvas naturally loosens over time. And because it's a fixed frame, the only way to solve this problem would be to completely re-stretch and reassemble the whole system. Later, we see the invention of the expandable stretchers. The idea was simple, but genius. You stretch the canvas onto the frame, and if the fabric loosens, you can use wedges or keys to push the bars apart and tighten the canvas. It's a system that has really stood the test of time and is still used today. So let's have a look at some modern day stretcher bars. Okay. All stretcher bars have three things in common. At the corners, they have a joinery that allows them to be fixed into place without falling apart. Two, on each inside corner, they have two little holes. These are used by grabbing a wedge or a key, placing it into one of those holes, and hammering it into place. This expands the joint, meaning you can regain any tension you may have lost in the canvas. And third and final, all stretcher bars will have a lip that runs across the outside edge. This supports the canvas away from the stretcher bar. All three of these traits I want to achieve in my own bars. But first I need to decide what kind of bar I want to make. So let's look at the different types of stretcher bars that exist. First, I'm going to show you one that I am not going to try and replicate, this one. The reason I don't want to replicate this one is because it has two machining processes. You see, you have to create this end and this end. The way it fits together is simple. It just slots in together like this. But the problem is, like I said, there's 2 different machining processes, so effectively I'm doubling the work I have to do. However, there are stretcher bars like this, which are very, very interesting. Both ends are symmetrical. They have the exact same joinery, just flipped, meaning I only need 1 machining process. So I will be trying to replicate this. But how am I going to replicate this? Well, I have access to a table saw. The thing is, table saws are terrifying. They're just these giant discs that are spinning at a high speed, and they can just launch the wood flying, hurting yourself, or even pulling you in. The thing is though, they're actually really useful, and here's why. So every single table saw has this little groove, and this little groove is really useful because I can grab a piece of wood which has another piece of wood that slides perfectly into it. This is effectively the base of a jig. What this means is I can create a steady cut every single time. You then build on top of it, like I've done right here. This is my first prototype jig. The way it works is very easy, and I'll show you now. Basically, it's a multiple stage process. At first you cut one 45-degree angle by putting a piece of wood here and then sliding it through. Then you flip it to the other side and you cut another 45-degree angle. Then the final stage is you cut an even bigger angle on this part. However, this makes a hole that is too thin, so we need to slide the piece over 1 width of the blade and cut again. This creates a perfect size gap for them to fit together. However, we don't have a lip, and that's really why this is a prototype. It's more of an idea of how it will function. So I need to build another one.
Okay, so how exactly am I going to add a lip to this? Well, it's not necessarily adding, but cutting away, leaving a lip. So at the moment, if I cut away all this material here, leaving a lip behind, I come across a problem, and that is that I expose the gap that's in between. This is what that would look like. This is the same piece, but I've just cut away, leaving a lip. You see, it completely exposes the gap in between. We don't want this because it will mean it's unstable and doesn't fix very well. But how on earth am I going to fix this? Well, it's pretty easy actually. What I need to do is completely change my cutting process. At the moment, I only cut once here, and then inside I cut twice, having a double thickness gap that then fits all together. I just flip this, so instead I cut twice on the sides and only once in the middle. This means this part here will be double the thickness, leaving me enough room to be able to cut away material and have a lip whilst maintaining that material here that keeps it stable. That should work. I just need to build another jig. Okay, so this is how the second prototype works.
it's exactly the same. So at first you cut the 45-degree angles here, you put it in and you do the first cut. You then have to flip it over, do another cut. Then you take the piece and you flip it to the other side, take a cut, flip the stretcher bar again, making its last cut. And then what we need to do is put a spacer to push the stretcher out a little bit and do all those cuts again. We then change the height of the blade so it's a little bit higher, and this is for the interior cut. I put the piece in and push it through the table saw. And this is pretty much the entire process for this jig. It looks pretty good, but there's a pretty big problem.
Okay, so this has been a lot harder than I thought it would be. This is the first version I made, just like a prototype, and it worked surprisingly well. It made the cuts and pretty accurately at the correct angles and whatnot. However, it didn't allow for a lip, which is really, really important for a frame. It needs a lip. So I then made this one, which is a neater version of the prototype. Same concept, same things. There's only a couple differences. I added an angle, so then it would cut. The internal cut, it would cut that, so it is an angle to allow for the wedge to separate the stretchers when it's stretched with a canvas. That isn't the problem. The problem is specifically cut when I'm cutting here at the 45-degree angle. What it's doing is it's cutting it so very slightly wedge shaped. It's slightly thinner here to here. So when I go to apply them, it doesn't fit. It doesn't fit properly because it's incorrect. And the reason I think this is happening is due to the way I am constructing this. At the moment, the way I've constructed it is I have 45-45 and then a piece of wood stuck on top of it. Doing it that way, getting it so it's exactly vertical is really difficult. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a brand new one, a new sledge. It'll be a sled with flatter material, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to stick a piece of wood first perfectly at 90 degrees using a square, and then I'll stick the 45-degree angles on top of that. That way I assure myself that the structure is perfectly vertical. Perfectly vertical. It has to be perfect. I cannot allow for any possible variations. It has to be perfect so that every time I put it in, every single cut is identical. That way they'll all fit in perfectly and it's perfectly repeatable, right? That's what I want.
Perfectly splendid.
Okay, time to make the final and third jig. And this time it's going to be better. I have a plan. One of the things I'm going to do slightly better is just use slightly better material, better wood. Wood that is harder and smoother and won't warp as easily. This way I know that the cuts that I'm making are the ones that I want instead of ones that are slightly out. Another thing is I have a much better system to actually construct it. So, like the other ones, start with a base. Once the base is done, I'm going to do something slightly differently. What I'm going to do is I've cut these perfect triangles out which have a perfect 90-degree angle to them, and with that I'll attach a board directly to them. That way I know that that board is perfectly vertical compared to the base and the saw blade. This means that the cut will be repeatable every single time, and that's really important. Now all I have to do is attach pieces to the side of this board for the angles I want to cut. For example, two 45-degree angles, and then the center cut of the stretcher bar, and I'll put that to the right at the angle that I want. This way I have a completely perfectly vertical setup, and because this time I'm not using any glue, it means I can adjust things very easily. You see, the problem with using glue, if you make a mistake, you have to tear everything apart and then reassemble it as best you can. But with screws, you can just unscrew something, drill a hole somewhere else, and then screw it back together. This gives me the flexibility to make adjustments if I need to. Now, I'm going to do a test cut, and that seemingly works pretty well. I do, however, need to test the next cut. And not bad. It looks pretty decent, Now all I have to do is, try and actually make a full set of stretcher bars.
I'm going to cut them somewhat off size because I want to see if the jig will actually hold it all in place. And that seemingly works pretty well. Now all I have to do is just cut the lip, and the lip is pretty easy. I just run it through the bandsaw to the width of the lip that I want, and there we go, stretcher bars, finished stretcher bars. It's actually kind of amazing. I really didn't think it would look good in any way, but in fact, they actually look pretty cool. They look like real stretcher bars. So now, let's just test it. Does canvas work on this? Freaking works. Now let's see if the wedges fit. It freaking fits. It fits and it works. I'm gonna hammer it now. Oh, amazing. Okay, so I just momentarily wanted to talk about the actual, well, let's kind of give a conclusion to this story. In the end, it completely worked, which genuinely shocked me. I really didn't think I had it in me to actually build something like this that would work. I'm not a carpenter by any means. I've done a little bit of carpentry here and there, and only ever really for painting purposes. So I was very surprised that this actually worked. The main reason I wanted to build stretcher bars is because here in Key West, my local art store only sells up to 36-inch stretcher bars. So I wanted to not only have the flexibility of going above 36 inches, but I also wanted to be able to be very specific with the size. They have 24 inches, 30 inches and 36 inches, but what if I want a 34 inch or 32 inch, or what about 39.3 centimeters? I can do that now. And what's also quite interesting is how much cheaper it is to actually manufacture these. So to build a stretcher bar, I had to buy the actual wood, but I buy this in like 8-foot, 9-foot lengths, and each one of those costs me $2.50 compared to a normal stretcher bar, which is, let's say, 36 inch, which here at the local store is going to cost me like $7. So if I imagine 4 stretcher bars is going to cost me like $28 versus doing it like this, in material cost alone, it's costing me what, like $5 for all 4, which is crazy. It takes me 30 minutes to make them, but I mean, that's literally how long it takes me to get to the store and back again. So I mean, it's way cheaper, really. So in the end, if you have the facilities to build such a jig, if you have access to a table saw or other such tools, I would recommend you actually doing it. Like, I've already considered it worth it, and I've had it for like a month or 2 now, and it's completely revolutionized the way my painting system works. I just paint at any size I want, whenever I want, which is awesome. So anyway, I hope you found this process enjoyable or even educational in that sense, and I'll see you next time.